welcome you to this latest monthly seminar on behalf of NERI. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today. Laurie Macfarlane is one of the co-directors of Future Economy Scotland. He is also a visiting fellow at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, a research fellow at the Democracy Collaborative, a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum, and a member of the North Ayrshire Council Community Wealth Building Expert Panel. He is also the co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. Now, he's going to present to us today on the issue of just transition, a subject that's very close to my own work, so I'm really fascinated to hear what he has to say about the experience of Scotland. So at that, I'll pass it over to you, Laurie. Although one point of just housekeeping, I suppose we'll be presenting about 45 minutes, if that suits you, and we'll have time at the end for question and answers. And that portion we're recording now, but that portion of the seminar won't be recorded. So I'll pass it to you.
Great. Should I stand up or sit down? I don't know if I'll be in the way if I stand up.
Maybe actually, if you might see it better if you keep seated, Joe.
Okay, well, great. Well, thanks very much to NERI for inviting me, and thanks very much all for coming along. As just heard, my name is Laurie Macfarlane, and I recently co-founded and co-direct an organisation called Future Economy Scotland. And we're a think tank, and the sort of rationale for us setting ourselves up, I suppose, is that I'd spent many years in the think tank space in London, and that tends to be in the UK where think tanks tend to congregate, because that's where the power has been. Obviously, in Scotland in recent years, we've had a lot more devolution, and yet the sort of landscape around policy development and research hasn't really kept pace with that. And as a result, sometimes the level of policy debate and also scrutiny on the government isn't necessarily as good as it should be. So that was the context in which we decided to set up the organisation. And our initial focus is a major 2-year project on accelerating a just transition in Scotland. Obviously, in recent years, we've seen governments around the world, as well as businesses, start to embrace net zero targets in order to tackle the climate crisis. And in Scotland, the Scottish Government set a target of becoming net zero by 2045. So that's 5 years ahead of the UK government as a whole. Now, obviously, decarbonising the economy is crucial, but the question of how we do that, and importantly, who benefits from that, is also absolutely vital. And, you know, we already see, both in Scotland and indeed across the UK and elsewhere, the scars of previous poorly managed transitions, for example, the deindustrialisation process that took place, with the impact of that still very much being felt in particularly mining communities, but also other parts of the economy as well. And as we prepare to embark on this new transition, it's really important that we learn mistakes from the past and don't replicate them. Now, the concept of a just transition is not particularly new. It's been around since at least the 1970s, rooted in the labour movement. And specific definitions vary, as I'll come on to talk about, but in principle, what they all tend to have in common is an emphasis on reducing emissions while also tackling inequalities and injustice and centering the voice of both the workers and communities impacted by the decarbonisation process. So in other words, just transition is saying that, you know, economic justice and climate justice aren't separate things. You know, they must be delivered hand in hand. So the Scottish Government, as I said, has this 2045 target. Now, despite those ambitions, which I think in the global context are not too bad, I think could be strengthened, but certainly overall is a good starting point. Despite those stated ambitions, we're very far off being able to deliver that. So our economy is deeply unequal. We remain heavily reliant on carbon-intensive industries for jobs and for our economy. And the Climate Change Committee has pointed out that in 4 of the past 5 years in Scotland, we have missed our climate targets. And there's a real concern that not only are we going to miss the targets, that we're actually going to potentially exacerbate some of the different inequalities that we have in the process of doing that. And so it does represent an enormous challenge, but it does also represent a huge opportunity as well. Because delivered effectively, not only can we decarbonise the economy, we can create new, well-paid, secure, unionised green jobs. We can tackle those inequalities. We can raise productivity and raise living standards if done well. Clearly, though, in order to do that, though, we really can't achieve those things by making minor tweaks to the status quo or just ameliorating some of the worst symptoms of our already unsustainable and unjust economic model. In order to deliver on any of this, we really do need to embrace bold new approaches to economic policy. And that's fundamentally what our project is about. And so in the time I have, I'm going to just share some reflections on how we are approaching the work on just transition. As I said, it's a 2-year project, so we don't have all the answers yet, far from it. But I'll share our approach and some of our analysis that's informing what we're doing, and also the work that we and the research we'll be doing. So throughout here, I'll be referring to data for Scotland. However, that being said, most, if not all, of the challenges and the examples that I'll be talking about apply equally across the rest of the UK, and many indeed in Ireland as well, albeit with some important differences. So I'll talk about what we mean by a just transition. I'll then talk about the key challenges in terms of economic challenges, inequalities, environmental challenges that we really need to overcome in order to deliver one. And then finally reflect on some of the different areas of policy that are going to be really crucial for Scotland. So firstly, what is a just transition? There's no universally accepted definition. Lots of different organisations have their own definitions. The ILO has a definition. Trade unions have sometimes their own definition. The Scottish Government also has its own definition of just transition. The Scottish Government has a Minister for Just Transition. It's also set up a Just Transition Commission. So it is something they're committed to. We, in thinking through our work, took influence from various different places, decided to come up with our own version of our definition, which sort of strengthens the Scottish Government's definition and really sort of aligns a bit more with the kind of economy that we want to see. So I'll just share this up just now. This is a working definition. And the way that we've defined it is a coordinated plan to decarbonise Scotland's economy and tackle the nature crisis, while creating well-paid, secure jobs throughout urban and rural Scotland, supporting the reskilling and retraining of workers as parts of decline of carbon-intensive industries, actively reducing social, economic and regional inequalities, alleviating poverty and increasing living standards, ensuring that impacted communities, trade unions, workers and businesses are given a meaningful stake and say over decisions that affect them, fairly sharing the costs and benefits of decarbonisation, including by embracing more democratic forms of ownership and governance, and ensuring that Scotland, as a high historic and current emitter, recognises the global imbalances created by climate environmental breakdown and builds a reparative approach. And so that's the sort of contours of how we're defining it. And we engaged with various trade unions and climate groups in Scotland to come up with that. It is a working definition, but maybe in the discussion would welcome feedback if anyone has any thoughts on that, or comments or suggestions would be much appreciated. So next, I'm going to talk about some of the key challenges that we face, because just transition, the way that we define it, is fundamentally about transforming the economy. It's not just narrowly about the energy sector, for example, which sometimes just transition is taught in that context. Energy is really important, but to deliver a just transition, it's an economy-wide transformation. And that means that we need to have a clear diagnosis of what the issues with our current economic model are, to then understand how we get from where we are to where we need to be. So I'll start on economic challenges, and then I'd want to talk about inequalities and environmental challenges. And the point of this very simple Venn diagram in the slides is just to highlight that these are all inherently interlinked, they're intertwined, they're not separate, they are very much interlinked and reinforcing each other. So firstly, on economic challenges, one of the biggest challenges that we have in Scotland and indeed across the whole UK is on living standards. We've heard a lot about the cost of living crisis recently, sometimes sort of presented as if this is a new thing. And it certainly is new in the sense that inflation has skyrocketed double digits, but we've had a severe squeeze on living standards for well over a decade now. We had real earnings fall sharply after the financial crisis, exacerbated by the post-crisis turn towards austerity. Although we did have some recovery in real earnings from kind of 215 onwards, the return of very high inflation has then seen another very sharp decline in living standards. And so Despite what's happened, real earnings today, so earnings after inflation, are lower today than they were back in 2010. And so, clearly this is a huge issue. And as I said before, in the way that we think about just transition, improving living standards, particularly for low and middle income households, has to be a key part of the priority. Clearly, the cost of living crisis doesn't hit everyone equally. And because the inflation has been fueled by things like fuel and food and energy, lower income households spend a higher proportion of their incomes on those goods. And so this chart here shows from the ONS that lower income households have experienced a much higher rate of inflation than higher income households as well. So there is a real distributional component to this. Sometimes we talk about inflation as if it's sort of one magic number. Obviously, that's looking at the whole of the UK for everyone, and depending on where you live and who you are, people experience very different rates of inflation in practice. So next challenge, before we go on to investment, another challenge just to say is just around poverty as well. We had steep declines in poverty, not steep, good declines in poverty during the 1990s in Scotland. In recent years, though, it has started to tick up again, partly because of the living standards issue, partly because of cuts to welfare, and persistent low pay in many sectors. And that's obviously a real issue, very concerning to be going backwards on that. And so, again, when we think about just transition, in order for a just transition to really be just, it needs to be raising people out of poverty, as well as raising living standards more across the board. The next challenge, though, is a really critical one in the context of just transition, and this is around investment. And so both Scotland and the whole UK for a long time has suffered from pretty chronically low investment. So this chart here shows the most recent comparable data that we've got internationally, and this is investment as a proportion of GDP for OECD countries. And you can see Scotland and the UK right down at the bottom. I think the only one that's lower there is Greece, which obviously went through an extremely challenging time with the Eurozone crisis. And so this includes both public and private investment, and both are going to be absolutely critical to delivering a just transition. If we can't mobilise investment in the areas needed, which I'm going to talk about, we will not deliver that just transition that we need. Now, in terms of the question that sometimes gets asked is, how is that? Because in Scotland, we have a big financial sector, and obviously the UK's got London, global financial centre. How have we possibly got one of the lowest levels of investment? And the answer to that really is that our financial systems today really don't do what the sort of textbook description of them is, which is finance productive investment in the real economy. In recent decades, financial sector has shifted towards primarily lending towards the financing of existing assets, primarily real estate, mortgages and commercial real estate, as well as financial assets as well. And so in the UK today, less than 10% of all bank lending goes to what you might call the real economy, so non-financial, non-real estate types of lending. And SME lending is between 2 and 3% of all lending, so what people describe as the backbone of the economy. So the financial system in this country is not really geared up towards financing investment domestically. It's much more oriented around sort of international finance. And that's a really important part of the issue. The second thing just to mention is just on foreign direct investment here. So in Scotland, the Scottish Government likes to brag about the fact that outside of the southeast, we have the highest rates of foreign direct investment in the UK. And so again, you think, well, if we've got that, how have we got such low levels of investment? And I think, important to recognise that FDI doesn't necessarily translate into actual investment in the economic sense in terms of gross fixed capital formation. It can do if investment's coming in and people are building factories and having good, well-paid jobs. But equally, it doesn't always do that. It could be, people coming in to buy up luxury real estate or whatever else. And so, I think it's important to make a distinction between the investment that we need and investment in the financial sector, which is about shifting around existing assets, and foreign direct investment. These things aren't the same thing. And really the question is, how do we increase this, which is gross fixed capital formation? So how much investment do we need? Well, the Climate Change Committee estimates that annual low carbon investment will need to increase fivefold So rising from less than £1 billion today to between £5 and £6 billion per year by 2030. And you might be able to see, you might not be able to read there, but the key sort of areas that we really particularly need to focus on is around housing and commercial buildings, transport, land use change, and energy as well. And so whether or not, as I say, we'll be able to do this or not is really going to be a key factor in whether or not we actually deliver a just transition. And given how chronically low investment we've got and how we're not very good at mobilising investment, this is a really key challenge. It's also worth mentioning, I think, again, coming back to private finance, we've seen in recent years globally elements of the financial sector kind of saying to governments, look, don't worry, we've got this net zero stuff covered. We've got trillions and trillions of dollars. You know, we'll fund this. And what's often not mentioned is there's often a catch, and the catch is, well, we'll do this if the state will de-risk for us, meaning if public balance sheets can provide de-risking mechanisms which will enable them to, yes, invest this, but not bear the risk and be able to generate those commercial returns, which is what they need to come in. And we saw a lot of lobbying around this, around the various COPs and stuff like that. And so there's certainly an important role for the financial sector, and we needed to stop contributing to the problem and start contributing to the solution. But I think there's a real risk of going down the route which is involves socialising risks and privatising rewards, which I think is really starting to happen in some places, because that, to our mind, wouldn't be consistent with the principles of a just transition. And importantly, investment isn't just needed in the places that can generate financial returns through markets. We also need investments in areas that deliver the highest environmental and social returns as well. And there are many parts of investments in a just transition context that have sort of public good characteristics that markets don't deliver very well, and actually can be more effectively delivered through direct public investment. And how we deliver that public investment in Scotland in the context of the devolved settlement is a real challenge. And I imagine, as it is here in Northern Ireland, there's also a challenge with regards to mobilising public investment without being able to sort of borrow directly. The next area is around industry and jobs. And so over the course of the past 5 decades, we've seen a huge shift in the structure of Scotland's economy. We used to be a manufacturing-based economy, as did much of the UK. We've seen a huge shift away from that towards a services-based economy today. So today, services account for 87% of employment and 77% of output. Outside the services sector, though, Scotland's economy is still very reliant on carbon-intensive sectors, and particularly oil and gas. We have the second largest oil and gas sector in the whole of Europe. And clearly, in order to meet our climate goals, we will need to phase out oil and gas in a controlled and managed way. And clearly, there's a question about, well, what happens to those jobs? There's, depending on what estimate you read and how you measure it, between sort of 70 and 200,000 jobs directly or indirectly linked to the North Sea oil and gas industry, many of which are pretty well paid compared to other parts of the economy. And now, some people will say, well, it's fine, we're scaling up renewable energy, you know, we'll shift them out of that sector and into the other one. And I think there's a real danger in thinking like that, because firstly, we can't assume that these jobs are transferable and the skills are the same, because they're often not. But also, if we look on current trends, we can see why, if we just sit back, it's very likely that this won't happen. Because what we've seen with Scotland's offshore wind sector, for example, in recent decades, is we've successfully scaled up offshore wind generation quite a bit. We still need to do a lot more, but really quite a bit. And that hasn't translated into domestic job creation at all, really. And in 2010, the Scottish Government projected that 28,000 workers would be employed in offshore wind by 2020. But the data from the ONS today shows that actually only 3,100 workers are directly employed in the sector. So that's 10% of what was promised. Despite us really meeting the targets on generation, we've not turned that into employment. Now, the reason for that is that much of the work has gone to companies based overseas, often in Europe, sometimes publicly owned companies from Europe or further afield, or companies that have had quite a bit of state support. And because of the capital intensity of renewable energy generation as an energy source, the major source of job creation there is in the manufacturing and construction phase. It's not in the operational phase. And because in Scotland and across the UK, we really hollowed out our industrial base and our manufacturing base, we really don't have those domestic supply chains to deliver that at all. And so, as I said, much of the wider economic benefits of renewables has been sort of captured elsewhere by others. And this is a huge issue because oil and gas is going to be phased out. We need to be thinking about how we can create new, well-paid green jobs. And I think this is really symptomatic of a long-standing failure around underinvestment, a lack of industrial strategy, etc., in this country, and a real short-sightedness. So the other thing to say about renewable energy is it's not just about the jobs, it's not just about the supply chains. There's also a question about actually who benefits more broadly from this. And I think it's really important that we learn lessons from oil and gas here. Oil and gas, I think, in the Scottish context, has been pretty poorly mismanaged over the course of the last few decades. And if we compare Scotland to Norway, we both have similar amount of fossil fuels, and we both extracted similar amounts of fossil fuels. Norway has the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, over $1 trillion, which contributes enormously to public budgets every year. The problem that they have is that it's almost too big and that they can't really spend it domestically because it would be inflationary. And they also have generated far more tax revenues from oil and gas. In the UK, we've not really got much to show for it, apart from many tens of billions of dividends that have been paid out to private shareholders over the year. And I think there's a real risk that these same mistakes have been replicated with offshore wind. And so we had the ScotWind option licence last year, which was the largest offshore wind leasing round in the world at the time. Huge amounts of leases going out to companies to be able to develop. And it was basically an auction to the highest bidder, and the companies that were awarded contracts, global multinationals, many of them fossil fuel companies. And in exchange for the licenses, the Scottish Government got £750 million in options fees. Now, that sounds like a lot of money to you and I, but in the context of the Scottish budget and in the context of the amount of revenue that's going to be generated through offshore wind over the coming decades, it really is a drop in the ocean. And so, as I come on to talk about a bit more, thinking about how we can share those benefits a bit more widely, for example, through public equity stakes, as has been done in some Scandinavian countries, I think is something that we really want to look at. So the next one I'll just mention briefly is around sort of rentierism and wealth extraction. So as well as the shift from services to manufacturing to a services economy, we've also had this process of ongoing sort of privatisation, liberalisation and tax cuts, weakening of trade union power, etc. And the UK obviously pursued this agenda with particular fervour. And we've seen one consequence is around the shift of power away from labour towards capital and the increases in inequality. But the other thing that I think is really important to mention is this sort of extractive rentier model. And by that, what I mean is where wealth is generated not through productive activity, but is generated through owning scarce assets and basically extracting wealth from others. And so the areas that can be quite prone to this is things like natural resources, things like land, oil, etc. Areas where there's really strong intellectual property rights, for example, and also industries where there's natural monopoly tendencies, things like energy and water networks, etc. And given the trajectory that we've been on, I think the UK really has turned into a sort of rent extraction paradise, really, where owners of these scarce assets have been able to make quite a lot of money at the direct expense of everyone else. And just to give a couple of examples of what I mean, if we talk about firstly the land in Scotland, so we have one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership in the world. And land has long been viewed as one of the original, well, was the original source of economic rent in the economy. Landowners, despite not actually contributing or anything productively, are able to absorb more and more of what's produced in the economy in the form of higher rents. And we also have a heavily financialised housing market across the UK, which is what I came to talk about last time I was at NERI, with huge amounts of wealth being generated simply just through owning property. I mean, that's how nearly 2/3 of all wealth accumulated in the UK since 1995 has been accumulated is literally just by owning property. And that's good if you own property. It's not good if you don't own property, because you're now having to face higher rents in the rental market or have to save more for a deposit. So again, the wealth that's been accumulated there has come largely at the expense of those who don't own property. And we can see this again in the energy sector, as we've seen over the course of the past few years. We've seen household bills soar to record levels, doubling or even tripling in some cases. At the same time as that, we've had fossil fuel companies making record profits, quite literally. And that's because the money that they're making is coming directly at the expense of households and businesses. And so this sort of zero-sum activity is rife in different parts of the UK economy. And I think that's really important from a just transition perspective, because clearly, as just transition, we want to tackle inequalities. And if those dynamics are a key engine of inequality, which they are, then we really need to think about that. The other thing, though, is that it's not just about fairness, it's also about efficiency. Having this rentier type economy is highly inefficient, because if there's opportunities to make more money through this kind of rent extraction, then it incentivizes a misallocation of capital. More capital flows into those opportunities, buying existing assets, rather than financing the new productive investment that we need. And again, I think that's illustrated by the banking point I made earlier, where almost all bank lending is just around financing real estate and things like that, rather than the investment we need. So looking at how we limit rent extraction in order to reallocate capital towards socially and productively useful areas, I think is really important. So next area, just around inequalities. So I'll be brief on this one. I think we all probably know that both inequalities of income and wealth are high by international standards in Scotland and across the UK. And on income, there's really two things going on there. One is that we have an unequal distribution of income before tax, just in terms of the structure of the economy delivers those unequal outcomes. But secondly, because our tax and welfare policies are not as redistributive as they elsewhere. And I think in the context of a just transition, we need to be looking at both structural reforms to make sure that we don't create inequality in the first place, and using tax and benefits to have more redistribution. So in other words, pre-distribution and redistribution both at work. And we see here wealth inequality significantly higher than income inequality. So while the highest earning 2% of households account for 9% of all income, they account for 18% of all wealth. And again, coming back to the rent point, a huge factor in the wealth accumulation in recent decades has been rising asset prices, particularly property. The final thing just to mention on the inequalities point is regional point. We have quite stark regional inequalities in Scotland. The UK is, as a whole, one of the most regionally unbalanced countries in Europe. In Scotland, we see a pretty stark difference a growing difference between major cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow and rural Highland and island communities, and particularly also challenges around areas that are currently reliant on oil and gas, so places like Aberdeen and Shetland. And I think it's really important that we're taking proactive steps to ensure that places like Aberdeen and Shetland don't face a similar fate to what are now former mining communities who had that industrial transition, deindustrialization happen, and just left to fall by the wayside, and they've basically never recovered. So again, that requires proactive strategic policy intervention to think about that now. So on to environmental challenges. So as I said a minute ago at the beginning, the Scottish Government set an ambition to deliver net zero by 2045. Now, since 1990, greenhouse gas emissions in Scotland have fallen by around 50%, which compares relatively favourably to the other parts of the UK. Obviously, there's a huge amount to do. Importantly, as this chart shows here, though, much of the progress in emissions reduction to date has been from energy. So you can see that in the sort of yellow bar there. That's obviously really important. A lot of that's been driven by switching from coal to gas, and then scaling up renewables. But in many ways, energy is the kind of low-hanging fruit here, because at the end of the day, from a consumer perspective, energy is energy. It doesn't different how you use it. It doesn't impact people's life necessarily. Going forward, we're going to have to see a major acceleration in decarbonising sectors, particularly like buildings, transport, industry, agriculture, land use. And some of these are tricky politically. So things like housing, for example, and transport, people's cars. This is where people live. It's how people travel. This is really going to impact people's day-to-day lives. And we need to make sure that this is done in a way which is fair and just. Because if it's done in a way which isn't perceived to be fair and just, then I think we can expect a mighty political backlash, and there'll be lots of opportunists waiting to capitalise on that backlash, climate skeptics, etc. And so thinking about how we retrofit homes, for example, or heat pumps, how do we actually share the cost of that is hugely important. And I'll just show, in thinking through that question, this is analysis we did recently, which was looking at the carbon footprint of households in Scotland across the income distribution. So there wasn't any data on this specifically for Scotland. And so what we find is that the carbon footprint of higher income households is much higher than lower income households. Unsurprisingly, that's the pattern that you tend to find. And in Scotland, the highest income 5% of households, carbon footprint's 4 times higher than the lowest. But the interesting thing is it varies dramatically within sector. So if you look at private transport, for example, which is mainly cars, the carbon footprint is 10 times higher of the highest income group than the lowest income group. And when you look at aviation, it's 11 times higher. And so when thinking through this question about how we share costs to decarbonise different things, I think thinking through about ability to pay, absolutely, but also thinking through about contribution and thinking about the polluter pays principle is really important, because these questions in Scotland, we're slightly further ahead. The rest of the UK are really pressing now. What do we do about housing? What do we do about transport, etc.? So. And this one here just shows the pathway that we need to follow going forward on emissions. So you can see the progress to date has been not too bad, but in order to meet those targets, and particularly that 2030 target, you can see there, that's a real challenge to get that extra mile. The low-hanging fruit is gone, so we really do need bold policy at this stage right now. The other thing just to mention on this is around ensuring that we don't decarbonise at home at the expense of other countries overseas. As I said before, both Scotland and the UK, as countries that industrialised very early and have been engaged in fossil fuel extraction, really contributed disproportionately to climate change, although we've not really borne the brunt of the effects of that. That's in other countries in the global south. Our net zero target that we have in Scotland and the UK only covers territorial emissions. So this means emissions that happen within Scotland's borders. So it doesn't cover emissions created overseas that are embedded in the goods and services that we consume here. Now, because we, across the UK, import lots of stuff, we don't really make much anymore. The difference between the territorial emissions and the consumption emissions is very large, and that's what this chart's showing. You can see that the gap between these two is getting wider and wider. And so in many ways, we're sort of offshoring our emissions elsewhere because we're consuming stuff, but we're saying, actually, well, they're making it over there. And so I think there is a real risk that we want to make sure we don't try and meet our net zero target by sort of offshoring the problem elsewhere, and really being mindful of our consumption footprint in terms of what we consume as well. And the final thing I'll just say on the environment side is around the question of carbon offsetting. There's been a real boom recently in carbon offsetting. So given net zero, the target, you can either reduce emissions directly or you can offset them by buying carbon credits, for example. And in Scotland, this has had a huge impact on the land market, because we've had this surge of investor interest from financial institutions, asset managers, fossil fuel companies, who are saying, okay, to meet net zero, we're just going to buy up land, grow some trees, and then that's it sorted. We don't need to change our behaviour. And Scotland, given that we've got such a hugely concentrated land market and we've got basically no regulation on who can buy land and a very generous tax and subsidy regime, we've been one of the global hotspots for buying land for carbon offsetting purposes. If you've got the money, you can come along and buy a huge swathe of the country with very little questions asked to do what you want with. And as a result, land prices have been soaring in Scotland over the past few years as this sometimes called green layered investment has come in. And obviously, rich investors buying land in Scotland is not new. We've got an archaic pattern of land ownership, aristocratic in many senses, but this is the next phase. And I think this is something that we're looking at because there's a real risk that carbon offsetting is a big distraction from the more urgent and more pressing task of actually reducing emissions. There's nowhere near enough land in the world to offset our way to net zero, not even close. I mean, I think to even for a company like BP to offset its own emissions, it would need land the size of many countries just to do that. And so, there might be a case to say offsetting only for emissions that genuinely can't be reduced, but at the moment it's just a free for all, and it's a voluntary market without regulation. So how we look at the question of carbon offsetting and prevent greenwashing, which is a big problem in it, I think is really important, and focusing the attention on how you reduce emissions, not just offset them. Okay, so in terms of going forward then, so that's obviously a lot of challenges to overcome in order to deliver a just transition. In terms of how we're approaching this, our work has 7 pillars, and I'll just go through these very briefly, and we can maybe pick up the ones that people are interested in the discussion. First thing to say is we're not pretending that we're doing everything related to a just transition, because we're not, because we don't have either the capacity nor the expertise, and there's already great work being done by others. So we're focusing on areas where we think there's opportunities to have impact, and there's stuff coming up politically where we can influence. And so the first one is transforming energy. This is mainly focused on the scaling up renewables as opposed to the fossil fuels, not because fossil fuels are not important, but because we're focused on devolved policy, and fossil fuels are reserved. And there's lots of great work being done by others on that. So looking at how we scale up energy, but not just scale it up, capture the wider benefits in terms of jobs and in terms of wider rewards from the sector. And as I said before, we're doing a bit of work looking at future offshore wind leasing and taking public equity stakes, which is some other parts of the world, including Scandinavia, have done, so that, for example, 20% of all the profits made over the course of the next 20 years would come back to the public purse, which we failed to do with oil and gas, but we would have made a big difference. The second one is around green industrial strategy. And so the role of the state in driving this transformation is going to be really critical. And in recent years, we've seen a real shift in this space internationally. We've seen Joe Biden come in with his agenda, which has really had quite a big impact, actually, globally in terms of investment, put pretty generous subsidies in place for companies to invest in green things domestically. We've also seen the EU take a more muscular approach here, partly due to climate change, partly in response to China and its economic model. And I think there is a real risk here in places like the UK and Scotland that other countries are really putting quite a lot of proactive state intervention into capturing a share of the global value chains in various green industries. And we've already been very slow to the mark. And if we don't move a bit quicker, we're going to miss out on that. And so this is about what does a bold, ambitious green industrial strategy look like for Scotland, looking at transforming both industries, different sectors, and also the labour market side of things as well. Proactive labour market interventions to make sure that we're reskilling, retraining, etc. And we're doing that work. It's a joint project with Professor Mariana Mazzucato at UCL, who have done work on industrial strategy in many countries around the world. And the next one is around land, nature and biodiversity. And this just picks up on the point I was saying a bit earlier on here about land use is critical for a just transition, and how land is owned and managed and used across many different uses is key. One thing I will say is, in terms of the things I said before that we're not doing, there are some things we're not doing. One big gap that we're not doing is agriculture at the moment. And the reason for that is partly because we can't do anything, we can't do everything, sorry. And the other thing is there's other work being done on this in Scotland. Obviously with Brexit, there's a question around what's happening with CAP, etc. So there's some work being done on that around public money for public goods and stuff. So that's not in the scope of this work just now, although it is obviously absolutely vital. the question of land, nature, biodiversity here is focused on things around nature restoration, woodland creation, peatland restoration, etc., which is crucial for meeting our targets and how we do that. And particularly in a way that is aligned with a just transition. So not a model which is just benefiting, say, asset managers from London who are coming up, planting loads of trees which aren't even good for biodiversity to extract the carbon credits while increasing land prices and pricing them out local communities. That's not consistent with a just transition, but that's what's happening now. So what does a just transition approach to nature restoration look like that genuinely delivers benefits for local communities, etc.? And there's a land reform bill coming forward in Scotland next year, which is partly why that's a priority. Next one's around housing in the built environment. So the dual challenge here of housing affordability, which is a huge issue across the UK, plus the need to decarbonise housing through retrofitting, etc. And particularly that question of how we pay for that, which is a real political hot potato at the moment in Scotland. And so doing a big bit of work on that, and yeah, happy to speak about that in a bit more detail if it's useful. And then greening the transport system, so scaling up affordable, integrated public transport systems, which in many parts of Scotland we don't have, but also using the powers that we have to rein in carbon-intensive forms of transport. So just to give one example, I mentioned aviation earlier, with the highest income households emissions being 11 times higher. The vast majority of flights in the UK are taken by quite a small percentage of the population who are flying business. And so one thing we're looking at, we do have devolved power over aviation tax now as a frequent flyer tax, so that everyone gets a small amount of flights a year, which are not taxed very much. And then with each flight, it gets ratcheted up completely to try and disincentivize that and also make the polluters pay, if you like. And then second last is around decarbonising local economies. And this is looking at just transition through the lens of community wealth building, which is an area which the Scottish Government has kind of embraced. A new approach to local economic development, which is very much about scaling up shared community ownership, pluralist business models, creating and retaining more wealth locally. I understand there's some work happening in Northern Ireland on that agenda as well. And we've got Community Wealth Building Act coming forward next year, which the Scottish Government's fond of telling us is the world's first act. So making sure that that is actually useful and not just sort of rhetoric. And the final bit, which is crucial, is around paying for a just transition. And this sort of ties it all together because particularly in Scotland, how you pay for all of this is really the key question. If you can't answer that, you're not going to get very far. And we do have more devolved powers over tax than we did before. So looking at how we both use the taxation powers that we have progressively to make sure that costs are shared fairly, but also make sure that we're raising the revenue that we need to do some of this, and also mobilising public investment on the scale needed to actually roll out quite a bit of this stuff. And so that's a big challenge. And that's going to involve sort of modelling of different revenue raising options and distributional analysis and all that kind of stuff. So I'm conscious I've spoke enough. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. One thing just to finish on though is that in doing this work, we are really keen to engage with others sort of working on these issues, not just in Scotland but elsewhere. So whether it's trade unions, research institutes, think tanks, campaign groups, I'm really keen to speak to others, exchange ideas, share knowledge, help us sort of strengthen the evidence base. And so, yeah, if anyone is sort of working on this, very happy to have a chat. As I say, we're always keen to speak to others. So I will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. So we might do, I'm not sure if any questions have come through the chat